and we're so happy that everyone is here. As everyone I think knows, this is the Land and Development Politics Unsettled, Progress and Challenges of Tenure and Governance Reforms, Land Inequalities, and Sustainable Land Resource Use in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Role of Research Roundtable. We're very excited for this roundtable, and I just want to briefly give an overview of what the planned structure is today. So after a brief round of introductions, we're going to allow our roundtable panelists to each speak, and we're estimating that folks can speak for up to 7 minutes. If people do not want to take all the time, that's fine. We have some flexibility with that. And during that time, we welcome both panelists and then people in the audience to contribute questions or comments via the chat functions. And I think we have both chat functions covered. So whatever chat function is available to you, please jump in there and we will capture those remarks and questions. After all of our panelists, we're going to have discussant comments from Professor Kathy Boom. And then after those comments, I will come in with a brief summary of the comments and questions, and I will put those back to our panelists. And then depending on sort of where we are, different panelists can return for a second round of engagement and discussion, and we can kind of be responsive to where the conversation takes us. So that is the plan. And I think just to finalize my beginning remarks, I'm going to provide the prompt that was given to all the panelists for this roundtable discussion, and then briefly introduce everyone. Before I do that, I just really want to thank Matt Candell and Julian Kwan because they made this panel happen, and it's through their incredible effort and hard work that we're all here today, and I think that should just be acknowledged up front. It's really wonderful what they've put together. So to return to the subject at hand, the roundtable is focusing on the following. So despite the recognition of the importance of secure land rights and the continuing concerns amongst international agencies with responsible land-based investments in agriculture, extractives, and urban sectors, public action to secure tenure rights and strengthen land governance has been slow to materialize, and it's largely driven by growth priorities. Globally, both scientific research and policy making on land tend to divide between parallel silos focused on land tenure rights, governance, and land policy on the one hand, and sustainable land use on the other hand, and these two silos rarely interact. In the unsettling global context of climate change, the COVID pandemic and its economic impacts, the renewed nationalism in politics, this roundtable will bring together international and UK-based researchers and policy practitioners to reflect on the following set of questions. Where processes of reform of land law and land administration began in the 1990s, and where do they stand today? How do current tenure and land administration systems best be adapted and developed to be genuinely inclusive, help sustain remaining global commons, and address indigenous and community land claims, in addition to securing individual property rights? How rights to land and property fit into current efforts to promote social and economic recovery following the COVID pandemic? What should the role of the private sector and development finance institutions, if any, be alongside public bodies? And what now are the priorities and future directions for research and for researchers working on land, given funding constraints? So I am just going to briefly introduce our panelists and then also turn it over to Julian Kwan for some preliminary remarks. So our panelists are going to be Dr. Ruth Mines-Dick, Principal Researcher at IFPRI, Dr. Stephen Lowry, Lead Economist at CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research, Odenda Lumumba, who's the former longtime director of the Kenya Land Authority, Dr. Lorenzo Catula, Principal Research and Head of Legal Tools Programming at IED, Chris Penrose Buckley, Senior Policy Advisor on Land at the FCDO, Dr. Fabian Lucalo, former Research Director with the National Land Commission Kenya, Jolene Sanjak, Senior Director, Land Tenure and Property Rights at Tetra Tech. And then, as I mentioned previously, we'll have Professor Catherine Boone. She's a professor of comparative politics at the London School of Economics, providing discussant comments. All right, so I am 1 minute over time, but pretty good so far. And I happily turn the microphone over to Julian for some opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, and welcome everybody. We are really grateful to have such a distinguished group of researchers and policy practitioners from international organizations from Kenya and also from here in the UK. So I'm very grateful personally to you all for agreeing to be with us today in this roundtable that's perhaps slightly unusual compared to many of the webinars that we're often in these days. This is a roundtable organized by a recently formed Development Studies Association study group on land politics and sustainability. It's one of 3 events we have at the conference. This is a roundtable about research and policy practice focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, and we'd be very interested certainly to hear the insights that you have. I'm certainly grateful to have had the opportunity to collaborate with many of you, and I know that you will have interesting things to say. It's a very broad agenda, and we've provided some guiding questions, and I think Alex has largely given most of the background, but I think just to point out that really in line with the overall conference theme, which is unsettling development, which very much conceived in this context of the COVID pandemic and other global developments, to reflect on the progress of land reforms in sub-Saharan Africa and on where we are today. These have been long-standing attempts at policy and governance reforms that continue to be challenged, I think, by land inequalities and the challenge of sustainable land use as well. And while these aren't exclusively African issues, there are certain commonalities with global issues. Most of the researchers, I think, here have had quite a strong focus, and the practitioners here have been quite strongly focused on Africa. So really, I mean, we wanted to get your reflections on future directions and priorities for development research on land tenure rights, on land use, policy and land governance. But really the important thing, I think, for this roundtable and this conference is the context of the continuing COVID pandemic, the effects and impacts that this has had on policy processes and on practice, what this may mean for land rights, for land governance, changes that are going on, the growing impacts of climate change, which I think more than ever is up for debate and is the context for most discussions about development, as well as increasingly open debates about racial injustice, about gender-based violence in all forms, the ongoing retrenchment of nationalism in many countries and changing political priorities, both for donor countries and for African governments and the predicaments in which they currently find themselves. And we felt that this context really gives us pause to reflect a little on the nature and purpose of land reforms. Also noting the wider debates that have been really prominent so far in this conference about the meanings of development and the often racialized nature of global development politics and the place of development studies in all of this. But to reflect in particular on how development research and policy practice can better engage to address the challenges of Africa's land reform processes, which of course include the increased presence of new actors in civil society, customary leaders, the private sector, and perhaps an increased role for regional, global institutions and technical agencies in progressing land reforms. So we posed a series of general questions, which Alex reiterated in advance, and we're really looking forward to hearing your insights and perspectives. And I think this is primarily going to be a discussion amongst the panelists. The audience is quite small, but we do have a number of interested PhD students and others who've expressed interest and associated with our recently formed study group on land politics and sustainability. We also have an opportunity afterwards to continue to discuss, if anyone would like, without an audience, and to continue networking amongst ourselves. So with that, I think I should just hand back to Alex, who can bring in each of you to share your insights and perspectives with us. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Julian. So we're going to start off, and Dr. Ruth Meinzendick is going to be our first speaker. And just to let you guys know, I'm going to try to keep time as best I can. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is when you have 2 minutes left, I'm going to put up this sort of small yellow sign. I think it's backwards for you. I probably should have written it.
No, it's fine. Okay, you got it.
You guys got it? Okay. So hopefully that will let you guys know when to sort of start thinking about wrapping up. But without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with this group, a lot of friends, and really an engaging set of questions you posed. I was really struck to begin with this idea of a bifurcation between the focus on land, tenure rights governance, and land policy on the one hand, and on sustainable land use on the other, because a lot of my career in this whole field has been about the necessity for tenure and governance in order to have sustainable land use and natural resource management. And we're not going to get one without the other. The evidence is pretty robust, and Steve Lowry can go into it in more detail, but secure tenure is important to provide the incentive and even the authority for people to invest in managing their land sustainably. That's really important in the context of the UN Decade on Restoration. Whether it's planting trees or controlling soil erosion, all of these things that take an investment, a lot of climate smart agriculture practices. Anything with a long time horizon, you're not, the tenure aspects become really fundamental. Matt Candell and I have been involved in some of the conversations on this UN Decade on Restoration, which, trying to underscore the importance of not just having technocratic approaches to that. Now, that importance of tenure applies from the individual level of women or even youth within households up to the collective level for communities to have secure tenure rights on the commons. The problem is, and I've had a bit of a foot in both of those worlds, but the problem is there's often an emphasis on one or the other. Women's land rights, which then focus a lot on individualization, or community land rights, which then often don't look at the rights of women particularly. And they're very different approaches. The so-called private property reforms are about consolidating all of the rights in one person, usually the household head, or sometimes co-heads if the women get registered, in a gender-sensitive approach. The collective rights acknowledge different bundles of rights held by different people. The problem is there are not as many standardized models for that. The individual private has had a lot of, titling kinds of reforms and registration reforms. I do think it would be useful for more countries to look at the UK Commons Act of 2006, for example. The reason I think this is important that a lot of land and people are in mosaics of land with both private and collective lands. And the ecological functions also require looking at both of those. So I think we need to sort of walk with 2 feet, addressing security of the most marginal on both types of land. That means not just passing legal reforms, but also implementing them. Often in the face of social norms that say women or pastoralists or certain tribal groups should not have land. You get a lot of people citing Rwanda's land titling process as a model, saying it should be replicated elsewhere. But there were a lot of particular conditions in Rwanda, including high state capacity, that don't necessarily apply elsewhere. And even in Rwanda, the implementation wasn't always straightforward. For commons, you're often battling an even bigger battle to get customary rights and collective rights recognized. In India, we're working with Foundation for Ecological Security to raise the profile of the commons. And we have a new study that shows, for example, that the total value of the commons is average values would be around $140 billion per year for the common lands. You need that kind of thing to get policy attention. And as much as a struggle as it is to get commons recognized, you have to look at the governance after it's recognized. That's where the equity comes in. How do you make sure that women, pastoralists, these other groups have real voice? We are seeing examples of how this can be done even at scale. It's not easy, but I think this is what we really have to do to preserve the ecosystem services that we all depend on, as well as the equity issues that I hope we're going to get into more about what land means for people. So with that, I'll turn over, and I hope we get more discussion of some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. That was in perfect time. And so I'm very happy now to turn it over to our next speaker, who is Dr. Stephen Lowry. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation. Thanks to Matt and others who pulled this together. I'm going to talk a bit today about a study I'm involved with a number of colleagues that looks to evaluate tenure interventions in sub-Saharan Africa in context. And this is, we're using here a sort of a systematic review methodology called realist synthesis, which is very kind of deliberate in design with respect to taking account of contextual factors that might explain how intended beneficiaries actually respond to interventions, to tenure reform interventions. And the specific interventions we're looking at here are two types. One is sort of the quite familiar partial demarcation, partial certification kinds of initiatives that we've seen in a number of African countries. They may not extend to conversion to freehold. They may, in fact, involve certifying or demarcating customary holdings, registering them, so on and so forth. Another type of tenure intervention in recent decades has been, well, for some time actually, has been redistribution of land. And this is typical more recently of Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa in some respects, historically, Kenya, and other countries. There are a number that, in fact, have sort of fallen off the screen that have been quite significant. So I want to say just a few more words about realist synthesis, because in the description, I think it helps us understand why context is important. So why do we choose realist synthesis as a model? We see it as a new and promising technique, more suitable than a systematic review for our inquiry. I was associated with a systematic review that really kind of spawned this inquiry. That review that was published in 2017 looked at the productivity effects post-certification in countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And our finding was that productivity effects, and this is the classic kind of concern of a lot of tenure interventions, the sort of underlying assumption that tenure security is inadequate to motivate, incentivize farmers to invest in productivity enhancing sort of investments. And we found that the response to certification post intervention in Latin America and Asia cases was quite strong. In Africa, it was positive, but not nearly as strong as in Asia and Latin America. And so we felt that, and we offered some hypotheses. Well, maybe higher levels of poverty, lower levels of public investment, undeveloped markets that might sort of enable farmers to leverage cash income to invest in agriculture. But that was conjecture. And so we found in the realist synthesis a method that was useful in explaining these variable outcomes potentially across countries and across contexts. Also useful for identifying the mechanisms that influences responses to interventions. And here we talk about in realist synthesis a model, it's called CMO, context, into which there are mechanisms or that are sort of responses to interventions than there are outcomes. And mechanisms have a very particular understanding. We think of, well, how do people respond to the intervention? And we sort of assume, well, there's an intervention, here's a response. Did it work or not? What we can do here with this method is it really treats the intervention as a resource that intended beneficiaries can use or not, or use in ways that were unanticipated. And so that there's a response, a very particular response by intended beneficiaries to the resource. And, you know, planners, evaluators also sometimes don't really approach the evaluation question in those terms. You know, people can do with this intervention, use it as a resource in ways, that is, respond to it in ways quite unanticipated or not understood by the designers. And they can use it in creative ways, or they can use it in negative ways, in unintended ways. And this is where we start understanding kind of responses and then outcomes. And then we can sort of relate outcomes eventually to, well, what does this mean in terms of a better understanding of context? I see I'm already talking too much about the context of the intervention. So sort of long story short, we focused on 3 countries for the partial demarcation. They are Benin, Ethiopia, Rwanda. Why those countries? A number of sort of explanations or elements, but there was a lot of literature, and we needed a lot of literature, and specifically literature that deals with context. And that's a weakness in literature on anything that looks at an intervention. They typically don't take on the contextual factors as a matter of course. And then we looked at Zimbabwe to look at the land redistribution. Oops, I've lost my screen. Can you? Oh, there we are, good. And so what did we find? Well, I'm just gonna, our findings are preliminary. They're under review, but just a couple of examples that I think give insight into some of the big questions around context. An example from Ethiopia. We had solid literature on the programs that are being managed at the regional state level that are certifying land and parcel at the parcel level and registering the husband and the wife as co-owners. That's a big innovation in the Ethiopian context. What we found was, based on the literature, that widows were using their much clarified rights to enter into rental arrangements with typically male farmers who had assets in addition to land that enabled them to deploy that land for agricultural production. And that may or may not have been an intended aim of the program, but that was the outcome. Women in Ethiopia faced many obstacles to actually engaging in farmers themselves. If I could just offer one more example, Alex, from Rwanda, Ruth mentioned Rwanda, there's a large number of women in polygamous marriages who, because their marriage is not registered under the National Marriage Act, do not in fact inherit land in terms of the land law. And so we found this very interesting adaptation where unmarried, that is legally, women who are not legally married are using the law to register the names, register their individual plots in their own names with the agreement of their husbands and naming their children as heirs. So in that case, the land law served as a resource for unmarried women with outcomes that in fact were not probably contemplated by policy. So I'm gonna have to stop there. I have so much more to say, but I hope that what I've said is maybe will animate some further discussion.
Great, thank you so much. That's excellent. We're going to move along now to Ondenda Lumumba for his comments.
I'm just on one particular slide with about 5 bullets. What I'm really talking about, the land reform and political and economic challenges in Kenya, is a lived experience of about 2 decades of engagement. And this engagement in a number of processes that started in the 1990s, more so since 1999. There were commissions of inquiry into the land systems, commission of inquiry into illegal and irregular allocations of public land. There were constitutional commission. And out of all that, I think the salient elements and outcomes of that was basically, we had the national land policy as an output in 2009. We had the constitution in 2010, a number of land laws that ensued from all that, ranging from 2011 the whole way up to 2016, with amendments coming in later in 2018, 2019. And that process was quite engaging. What is important in this is that we have had about a decade or more than a decade of implementation. But this implementation has been very slow, selective, and if I wouldn't miss my word, I would say sluggish. Sluggish in the sense that the government did not put budgets to implementation. Those in charge in the government were expecting resources from elsewhere, especially from donors. Some of the resources could not come in easily. And where they came, they disagreed on how to utilize the resources. And that actually lasted as it were. And within the same period, we ended up with 10 years lapsing for the national land policy to be reviewed. And since 2019, it has not been reviewed to date. Some of the critical challenges have been revisiting the renewal of leases. And the leases are very interesting in the revisiting because there was a provision in the Constitution limiting non-citizens to leaseholds not exceeding 99 years. And yet, these are leases, so that if they are to nationals, it would appear in the interpretation of the nationals that they could have leases of more than that period. And essentially, that more than that period is the peculiar period in Kenya of 999 years of leases, which is basically leases in perpetuity, if you would call it. The other most challenging element has been the redressing historical land injustices, of course, coming from the colonial past through the contemporary independent times, and up to now, the injustice still exists in the country. The most other important challenge that remains is transformation of the community land category into the properties of the community in varied definitions of the communities. This has been very challenging to the extent that the government has introduced the land value index law, essentially to caveat that propertiness or the property rights of the communities in land. And that has been very challenging. The other thing is the governance of this land, which has been almost under trusteeship in terms of its management. So that remains some of the main challenges that Kenya still face. What requires more research in Kenya is really addressing the land registration system, which is basically based on the private land ownership, which cannot essentially really work for the community land category, which is collective group rights kind of arrangement. And that, with all the efforts that we should have it registered and the communities being eager, how to go about that is just a nightmare to the moment. The other further area of research, in my view, would be really the underlying vision behind this development policy that seems to embrace mega projects approach in a country which is basically made up of small holders virtually in land matters. So you come up with mega projects, which you think they would kick start development broadly, but those mega projects in essence appears to be dispossessive in nature of the smallholders, or if not, the common areas or common properties that exist. And this has actually created a big debate in terms of in the extractive industry, in mining, oil and gas, in terms of regional development infrastructure, linking up Kenya to East Africa and the broader Africa in terms of infrastructure. It has also created problems using the commons at the ocean, the Indian Ocean mainly, which is a borderline, of course, leading us into even more nightmare with the Somali, with whom we are disputing the boundary on our coastal line. And I think for me, these are some of the elements that I look at. And I think redefining ourselves about land reform, I think we need to know that while Kenyans agitated for, let me just finish with this sentence. While Kenyans agitated for land reforms, essentially you could say from below, a lot of the land reforms appeared to be influenced from above. And above was not only from the state, it was from donors, it was from international organizations, and essentially it was a kind of a framework that everybody was supposed to fit in within Africa. It came with the World Bank policy direction, EU guidelines, the African policy framework and guidelines, and all those things are overwhelming. I need to respect time, and anything can be discussed in the extra time, especially with the questions notwithstanding. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, great. So we've unshared the screen, perfect. Thank you so much, that was wonderful. Next up, we have Dr. Lorenzo Catula.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex. And it's wonderful to take part in this conversation. And yeah, I'm delighted to be here today. Very interesting set of questions that you raised, Alex, at the beginning of the session. And interesting that the first one was about sort of what's happening with the wave of land tenure reforms adopted in the late 1990s onwards. And it's interesting because when I first started working on land rights issues was about 20 years ago, in early 2000s, there was certainly an atmosphere of hope and optimism very much around that set of reforms that were passed in several countries, where some of the new laws were placing greater emphasis on recognizing customary rights, more emphasis on gender equality, more emphasis were relevant on recognizing pastoralist rights, a greater devolution of land administration responsibilities or management responsibilities at the local level. And it wasn't just legislation, it was also a set of programs and initiatives that sort of came to support the implementation of those reforms in different countries. And be interesting to look forward to reading the findings of the research that Stephen was presenting earlier. But I think looking back on the issues 20 years later, my impression is that the overall mood is a little bit more muted. You know, the picture is a bit mixed. We certainly come a long way here in terms of advances made in specific places at the national level, at the local level, also globally. We have a number of international instruments that didn't exist just a few years ago. And even just the recognition of land as a key policy issue, right? It's certainly more prominent today than it was back then. But equally, continuing challenges, continuing problems in many contexts, and the list is long, partly because the contexts are very different. But I think the global land rush that spiked about a decade ago really highlighted some of the challenges that remain, even in those countries that did change the legislation, that did enact and establish programs to secure, formalize land rights, including customary rights. You know, we saw problems linked not just to limited implementation of legislation, but also some of the inherent limitations of the approaches as they exist, sort of ambiguous or contradictory policy objectives in some cases, policies that didn't really change the fundamentals, important blind spots in many cases where you have consultation requirements, but very little by way of safeguards in the case of compulsory land acquisition. And so we've seen a significant degree of conflict over the past few years in relation to land. And I think large-scale investments are certainly not the only or possibly even the main source of conflict, but certainly one that has brought out the issue very powerfully in the public agenda. And I think compared to 20 years ago, when sort of that wave of reforms were being enacted, we're also in a very different context, new challenges or more pressing challenges that were there already. The climate imperative is more pressing today than ever. There is a body of research, several reports, including relatively recent ones, that show the strong link between securing customer and indigenous rights, particularly collective rights, and climate mitigation. But there are also questions as to whether we should also explore limits to rights. Very often the emphasis in our work has been about strengthening rights, securing rights, but actually should right holders be entitled to cause damage by burning forests, for example, to create large-scale plantations and so on. So exploring limits to rights as a way to also link the climate, link land to a climate discussion. Another important trend that we're observing is the energy transition, also linked to climate, but the rise of the electric as a sector, right? So we need to electrify, and that changes the nature of commodity markets, more demand for copper, cobalt, nickel, lithium, etc., etc. We're already starting to see pressures in particular contexts, some of that in large scale. Quite a bit of it, cobalt in the DRC, is artisanal miners. So new issues, well, not new issues, but new dimensions of long-standing issues around the interface between land and subsoil resources. The COVID pandemic, of course, I saw the 2 minutes, Alex, thank you for that. The COVID pandemic has, of course, exposed and compounded many problems. FDI declined in the short term, but there's a concerted policy thrust on the part of some governments to promote investments, including in land-based sectors, to kickstart the economies in the post-pandemic recovery. And of course, land rights issues are going to be prominent there, but also at the more granular level, urban to rural migration processes and rural to urban as well, that sort of is compounding pressures on land, competition on land, including in rural areas, gender dynamics, where you have greater competition and reports, initial reports at least, of women losing out, regulatory rollbacks, sort of governments using the pandemic as a moment to renegotiate, in quotes, sort of environmental safeguards, social safeguards, etc. So a lot of new challenges, or a lot of more pressing challenges. And I think with regards to the question on the private sector, I think the private sector could do a lot to address some of these challenges, but really some of these problems are systemic and require systemic solutions. So we need to look at the sort of more wider range, more wide-ranging governance reforms. And it's useful perhaps to interrogate ourselves, ask ourselves, what is it that made it possible 20 years ago plus to have those reforms? And they were often part and parcel of wider processes of political change, political transition following the end of the Cold War, etc. And so a greater emphasis, I think, on understanding the politics, in my view, is a key step going forward. And that means that we may want to be more politically savvy in how we do our work, whether as researchers or practitioners, but we may also want to rethink the fundamentals of what we do, also in light of what Julian was saying earlier about north and south issues in this space of research, and sort of issues of political legitimacy. Who's best placed to raise issues that are politically sensitive when you're talking about national governance reform? In my view, all this points to really shifting the balance more and more towards voices of practitioners, researchers that are based in the global south, who can engage with government to promote the sort of systemic change that we need going forward. Sorry, it was a bit rushed at the end because I know I ran out of time, but very happy to discuss more if there is interest in the discussion.
You're perfectly on time. Thank you. That was great. Next up, we have Chris Penrose Buckley. So I turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for this opportunity to join this discussion and learn from all these all your insights. I want to just reflect a little bit on I think some of the middle questions, particularly around the work the UK has supported in East Africa on land reform, and what we sort of have taken from that in terms of lessons and insights to inform future work, which I think is sort of pertinent to many of the points that have been already made. So, I mean, Rwanda and Ethiopia often gets held up as sort of great examples of large-scale reform. And those are obviously the two big ones that the UK government has supported over the last 10 plus years. I mean, on many levels, they've achieved much, particularly around learning how to do large-scale registration in a participatory way to ensure women's rights are registered. Obviously, teething problems there, particularly Rwanda, but I think some of those have been addressed. And some really interesting experience also about how to stimulate demand. So that example you gave, Stephen, from Ethiopia on rental markets, that really has been an intention of the LIFT program to stimulate rental markets so that you get more productive use and benefits to those who have land and those who don't. So I think there's some really good experience there. I guess the problem with both Rwanda and Ethiopia, as Ruth already said, is that they're not paradigmatic. I mean, they're kind of outliers in terms of government capacity, central control, ability to follow through over many years, etc. And so I think that's important to note. The entry point for the UK in both those cases was government demand for registration at scale for a range of different reasons. So that was sort of axiomatic that there was political will, and the approach was therefore also largely supply driven. Julian has been heavily involved in the work that the UK supported in Mozambique for many years, which I think in some ways is more representative. It's been complicated, some fantastic bottom-up work to register collective rights, but not really a coherent national level vision for how those would be integrated. And a lot of the work has, if not stalled, but certainly been hampered as a result. And it's not a very clear outcome. So what does this mean for our future work? I just want to sort of three sort of lessons or insights. I think the first one is that we have to start much more with the politics. I mean, it's kind of in a sense an obvious point, but I think a lot of land work starts with technical solutions. And so I think we need to focus much more on what the political space is and learn how to work with the grain, if you will. And I think often that means that what we do on land is much more of a holding strategy or tinkering rather than really being able to support large-scale reform. A second point, obviously, also in the context of the wider discussions of this conference, is what is legitimacy of a third country to support land reform in another country, particularly if you're talking about engaging in the political space, and all the discussions around that. So I think that's something which we're very mindful of. I think there's another point. I think there is plenty of sort of research and on political economy analysis, but the sort of standard model of someone going in writing a 50-page report really isn't terribly useful, right? So I think we need to think about how can we bring all the expertise and insights from academia into more operational tools, and how to get beyond just analysis into political economy engagement, right? How do you actually then engage with reform champions? How do you support deliberative dialogue between different actors, right, to move things forward? That's where I think there needs to be a lot more focus. And then obviously there's a challenge for us donors, if you will. How do you design programs that are far more flexible, adaptive, rather than the standard kind of delivery model that really doesn't work? The second sort of reflection or insight is around the need for a much more demand-oriented approach rather than supply-driven. I think that needs to happen at two levels. One is understanding what do land users, what do citizens, households actually want, you know, rather than assuming they all want a certificate. I mean, we've all probably been visited land programs where you actually ask the farmers what they're going to do with the certificate, and they can't always give you a very sort of satisfactory answer. Not always, but often. So I think that requires a lot more thought, and I think that's where the work that LIFT has done in Ethiopia around driving demand and really thinking about how do you stimulate the market is really important. And then obviously we need to think much more about land administration systems. How do you make them sustainable? What are the incentives for people to register transactions after the initial first registration, which could then actually finance the system in the long run, rather than thinking that sort of at the end or halfway through a program. And that brings me sort of to my last point, which is really around legal plurality and geographical differentiation. So I think there's been a problem that most big land programs have just had a one-size-fits-all approach,
Perfect timing. Thank you. Next, I turn the floor over to Dr. Fabian Lucalu, and I think Matt is going to share a slide.
Thank you for this meeting, and thank you for having me today. And my discussion this evening will be based on my experience while I was at the National Land Commission as the Director of Research. So I go to the Commission in 2013 and to establish the Directorate of Research. And some of the basic questions I ask myself is what, where, when, how, where is all this information available? What has been done in the land sector? And it pushed me immediately to the whole question of evidence-based research and practice to influence policy. Because those questions were not answered in a day, they were not answered in a year. It took me a lot of time. The reason being, I was looking for where the systematic reviews, where the court documents, where do we get the data collected, how is it captured, stored, where is it archived? And sometimes today, by the time I left, some of the question has not quite been answered. And so, which institution is this that builds knowledge on land that somebody from outside or really within the National Land Commission can be able to use that? Also, other questions were the personnel, the capacity. Is it work as usual, or are we looking at it in terms of sustainable development? So, and one thing I concluded is that the government process is very bureaucratic, it's very systematic, and it's very steady. Yet, that's not the relationship that people have with land. People's relationship with land is dynamic, it's informal. Sometimes it has various shades, the shade of elitism, the shade of an ethnic shade. It can have, a gendered shade, and also it can be very fast to the extent that there can be conflicts on land between today and tomorrow. So for me, there was a gap between the processes in government in generating information that would influence people's lives or sustainable development, and how people think and interact with land. And I think now Matt can do the slide. So this is just an example of what I've been saying. So for this particular discussion, I thought about, what we call the medium-term plans. The Kenyan government works on MTPs, medium-term plans. We had a medium-term plan 2013 to 2017. We have one 2018 to 2022. And, you realize the title of the medium-term plan 18 to 22 is Transforming Lives. And I just picked out of that what I call the land reform thematic area is globally competitive, sustainable land management. That is very interesting for this discussion today. And one of the program areas, there are about maybe more than 6 key program areas. I just extracted the one on registration and issuance of title deeds, which was a common running theme from 2013 to date. And if you look at this particular slide, I don't want you to analyze the details, but from me, it just screams evidence. It just screams, where am I coming from and where am I going? As a researcher in the land sector, why do I need 3.2 million titles in 2013 to 2017? And then we turn that around in 2018 to 2019 to something that's not really a priority, but now we are beginning to look at another area that is operationalizing of Community Land Act. Yet at the same time, title deeds are still being created and formed in the particular country, in Kenya. Therefore, land titling is a national activity. It is an important source of information, and we can decide to put in various variables there. However, how does that turn into evidence that we can use as a country for instance, sustainable development? How does that turn into into evidence? If you look at that table again, you look at the various land tenure systems just flying out of the slide. There's public land, there's private land, there's community land. And of me, what is important is that time is stagnant. 2018 to 2022, I have just extracted one programmatic area, and I can read a lot. So I'm asking, are we biting too much in our plans? Are we not thinking what the citizens want in order to articulate that in big policy documents like this? And also, looking at this table, for me, it emphasizes the inventory of rights, restrictions, and responsibilities. Various agencies are there. There are certain rights, restrictions, and responsibilities for various agencies. It alludes also slightly to devolution. And when I talk about devolution, looking at this slide, I can multiply that by 47 other questions in terms of where is this evidence to be found. And lastly, how do we track the evidence and in the information a program like this can give a country like Kenya, and also can give probably information to the East, to the African region? And lastly, can we trust the information being derived out of this program? Can it be extensively used today and tomorrow? How do we enhance accountability, not only in the programs given, but also in accountability in terms of the processes for titling and inclusivity for all the citizens in the country? And then lastly, how do we track that in 2013 and 2017, indeed 3.2 million titles were processed and registered, and therefore in 2018 to 2022, we need lesser parcels on which land category. And I'll just throw that in there. Currently, we have a cocktail, and the cocktail is not just COVID-19, but we have IMF austerity measures. When you begin to pepper that into the whole discussion of the key flagship projects in the land sector, where do we begin to embrace evidence-based practice to influence land policy? Thank you.
Perfect, right on time. Thank you so much. Now I will turn the microphone over to Jolene Sanjak. So you're up next.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to reflect on the question posed about the role of private sector, and particularly in relation to, excuse me, the need, in my view, to reconsider how we understand pathways to scale and sustainability, mostly in relation to land documentation and land administration services. Julian said the agenda of land governance, land reform is very broad, so I'm focusing on that. And just wanted to say also that, excuse me, that I'm bringing some perspectives from my work in the NGO sector in the US government and in fact academia before, and not just my position at Tetra Tech. You know, Lorenzo and others, I think, talk about the private sector very importantly from the perspective of big agribusinesses or extractive industries that hopefully are increasingly engaging in responsible investment and can therefore impact positive change. But there are actually three other kind of aspects of private sector or elements of private sector that are engaging. One is the Tetra Tech type companies, right? We're classic private sector consulting service providers as implementing partners to the FCDO, to the USAID, to the development partners, basically, and essentially are an extension of those entities by virtue of having largely scripted terms of reference, et cetera. There is some uptick, and Chris mentioned his view on that, of increasingly allowing for co-design processes post-award together with local stakeholders and collaboration on learning and adapting. So that's a good trend, but we're essentially an extension of the development partners. There's also the public-private partnerships in which bigger tech companies might partner with or might be financed in a structured finance model by development finance institutions to invest in, mobilize dollars, bring more cost-effective designs and potentially sustainable service delivery models for establishing land administration systems. I want to, however, focus attention and call for more attention to looking at the another emerging type of private sector engagement that I think is maybe particularly important for scaling and possibly also for sustainable, affordable service provision. And these are what I call demand-led, private serviced fee-for-service models of delivering land documentation. And I don't have a more pithy label for that, sorry. We can come up with one. But anyway, I'm basically, I'm seeing an uptick in traction on some of these models. I'll give examples in a minute. And the reason I think they're particularly important for scale is essentially along the lines of what Ruth and Chris have said about, on the one hand, Rwanda, Ethiopia being tremendously impactful in those countries and offering really good, important lessons to the global community of practice about how to do certain things. They are essentially, in my view, not widely replicable. And there's a few contexts where they're replicable. So we need to really rethink about what are the pathways then for scale. So just to give some examples so you have a better sense of what I'm talking about, there are actually a lot more. There are a lot of, there's sort of an increasing number of social entrepreneurs pairing with social impact investors, larger private companies or larger NGOs, and even local NGOs that are starting to engage in this type of model. The very first one that I knew of, at least, was Medim, a company called Medim, who had angel investment and went in Ghana and tried to jumpstart a local company to do land documentation. It didn't succeed. They then did the same thing in Zambia, and it's actually starting to succeed. So there's a piece of research, or applied research, being kind of case study research being done by some of my colleagues at Tetra Tech, looking at the comparison of these models and why, what are the things that are driving emerging success and some of the failures. It's not ready to be published yet, but it's coming out soon. There's also Medici land governance. I think that's capturing a lot of people's attention right now by virtue of them having now a very big agreement with the government of Zambia to document some 5,000 rural land parcels on state land, not in customary settings. Medici and actually some local district land alliances are doing this model in customary settings. But Medici also has basically social responsibility investment. So the owner of Overstock.com, which is a huge online retailer, has invested in, along with some other investors, in jumpstarting. And they have a model that is based in social entrepreneurship, but is funded so that they can actually fund the titling work up front and get paid when they produce the results, maybe by a combination of the government or a donor or the citizens themselves on a fee-for-service basis. Meridia is another company that operates, in sub-Saharan Africa. They're now partnering with two big companies, Ecom and Hershey Chocolate, with support of GIZ and Chocolate Foundation of Germany, to really work with the government to plot out what's the enabling environment, then pilot a fee-for-service private service model and find a path to scaling it. So they're actually intentionally looking at scale. And there's a lot of others. I don't have time to talk about them. What I wanted to do then with the remaining time is just say, what are the key issues that really could become a learning agenda on this? And there are a few studies that I know about, but not very many. One is like, what's the best model to get the jump starting of the model? But all the early experiences are showing there's sort of a high cost of initial investment and a need to titrate the model and tailor the models to context, not surprisingly in the land business, and to find the business models that lend to sustainable service provision, not just for first titling, but for ongoing transactions in affordable ways. And as you know, big companies can afford R&D, social entrepreneurs and local NGOs can't, right? So who's paying for that? Angel investors, maybe development partners, as part of a package. Another question is fee setting and finance from the perspective of the citizen whose rights are being documented. So what's the appropriate pricing structure, considering a lot of things like business model and affordability? And are there ways to finance? There's a company called Suyo in Colombia that now has a microfinance product actually funded by invested in by a motorcycle company for whatever reason, that is giving microloans for citizens to pay for the $50 to get their title serviced by that by Suyo. So there's interesting models, but what's the right structure for that? What are the issues? And then what makes the context ready? Ready, maybe a tool like the PPP tool to assess readiness to engage this model as a part of a pathway to scale. And then are there risks from a social and inclusion perspective? From what I've seen, and this is just heuristic, just one last sentence, this is just heuristic, but with the standards like the voluntary guidelines, LADM, STDM on the tech side, and other things, and the fact that these are largely emerging by tech entrepreneurs pairing with actually real land expertise from the countries they're working in and globally. I think they're probably doing a pretty good job on that front, but should be looked into. And then impact-wise, if these are demand responsive, so maybe they're targeting geography better along the lines of what other people have said, and if you do titling where it's not in demand, all those things, is it having more impact? Is it more sustainable? Is it going to actually scale? So I'll leave it at that, but it's an interesting area, and I think it should be part of the contemplation of what's our role going forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was perfect. So thank you to all members of the roundtable thus far. You guys gave really insightful and thoughtful contributions. I now turn the microphone over to Professor Catherine Boone.
Well, thank you, Alex. And I would also like to thank all the participants and the organizers of the panel for putting together such an interesting kind of banquet of ideas and contributions. So I'm actually going to try to summarize and capture some of what was said, but I'm not sure I'll be able to do much justice to the richness of the discussion. So I'll try to keep it short also. I think one thing that is kind of in the background of everything that we've said is that land is a political and a regulatory issue with such widely systemic features that it really intersects with, everything that anyone could have an interest in. I mean, gender, food, development, sustainability, health, the spatial economy, state structure. I think that helps to explain the confluence of so much interest around this issue in the last 25 years or so, but also the complexity. And one of the themes to emerge from this panel, I think thanks to the organizing questions that we got from Julian and Matt, is this notion of a trajectory of the unfolding of a process or a movement over the course of maybe 20 or 25 years of policy innovation. And Odenda Lumumba and Lorenzo Cotula both alluded explicitly to this, of a period of time in the late 90s or early 2000s where there was a lot of not only optimism, but also policy innovation at all levels, from the constitutional level down, through land policies, through policy implementation through policy implementation on the ground. And kind of thinking back on this from the present, sort of a sense of I think Lorenzo said maybe a kind of somber mood or a feeling from Odenda Lumumba that there was a sluggishness. And I think maybe one general thing that we realize in retrospect is especially the focus on formal titling. Formalization and titling was perhaps often envisioned as what we can see in retrospect as too much of a technical fix, in the sense, a couple senses: the one size fits allness, the rollout of the national level programs, and also all of the theorization or beliefs about what titling would do, in terms of, making investment and securing rights and helping alleviate some of the gender inequities in the sector, et cetera. So I think indeed much of what was said by way of forward-looking commentary here kind of pushes off maybe from ideas, kind of rethinking of that. And I was struck by Stephen Lowry's description of a research process that he called realist to synthesis. I like the realist part, saying, okay, look, maybe we need to look at how complicated this is in particular contexts, and then look at an intervention just as an intervention and be very open-minded about what effects it might have and for whom, and really ask, like, how did people respond, rather than necessarily, I think policy evaluation till now has said, well, this titling will lead to investment. Has it done so? And I think we have, as he said, very mixed answers on that. But a different way of asking that question is indeed, much more open-ended approach, and comparing across contexts and being very sensitive to variation in time and place, and the institutional, social, economic settings all the way down. So there was this sensitivity to context and this open-ended approach to looking at responses. And Ruth also started off by talking about something about context that is perhaps generic across context, is this mosaic of land rights, and sort of the complexity of rights embedded in any particular situation. So maybe one way of beginning to talk about that as a heuristic is individual to community, and to see also these as not trade-offs or types of rights that may be certified in different contexts, but indeed kind of a layering or a mosaic in a particular given situation. And a couple of the interventions also underscored this idea of the importance of community land or the commons. And one thing that came out, I think, in a few different ways was the idea of sort of desire for more and better models of how to move forward. So we kind of know what the model of titling is, although of course there are a lot of complexities therein, but how to think in a more, how to think in a forward-looking way about how to operate in these mosaic situations that differ across context, and where can we find those models. So that's a kind of research, if you want, that it thinks very broadly and comparatively and goes looking. But a number of the interventions, I think Chris Penrose Buckley's idea, and even Vivian's intervention, and Odenda Lumumba's this idea about, well, what about thinking about demand more from the bottom up? So what are people really hoping for or needing in these contexts, and how can you tailor responses to demand in a situation where maybe the one size fits all is not going to work, or is not going to happen for any one of a number of reasons. So this understanding demand from the bottom up, and understanding that kind of demand is probably going to be different across space and social groups. And if I can just add one thing that we haven't said here, I think the idea of local flexibility, tailoring, demand up, now intersecting also with Vivian's idea about information and documentation, sort of all adds up to a very strong case for financing or supporting, participating in, endorsing the development of research capacity, really from the ground up within the advocacy organizations and the university settings, and land use management units within universities, and organizations like the Land Alliances or Unidas Formación that works in East and West Africa, to really have generations of, let's say, well, to nurture contexts in which generations of new researchers who can do field work, who can collect information, who can hear those voices, who can contribute to thinking really in very nuanced ways about variations across contexts, in ways that, new models for research and innovation that then would differ from a one size fits all that's imported from the exterior. So I think it takes a lot of capacity building and learning and innovation and research that comes from within countries. And so one of my own sort of ideas about this is really the importance of developing that local capacity really within universities. And maybe I say that because I'm a university person, but universities and the ancillary and partner and sister institutions within countries to work on land issues. So thank you, Alex. Let me turn the mic back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. That was great. So now we have, I think, time which we had set aside for people who had made comments in the chat, of which I can see none, but it does not mean there are none. It may just be that I cannot see any. So if anyone else sees them and I don't, you could step forward now. But if it is indeed true that we have not had any questions in the chat, I think we could move to a model where anyone from the audience, whether it be a panelist or someone who is just here to see the panel, can raise their hand or they could wave to me. I will try to view all of you if possible, if those of you have your camera on, but you can also raise your blue hand and could speak out and ask a question. And I guess the way I would suggest we do it is to take a couple of questions and then we could turn it back over to the panelists for another round of kind of discussion and response. So is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Maybe first from someone who's not on the panel. I would like to open it up. So I see Carolyn, please go right ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for these interesting.
Carolyn, you're very quiet. I don't know if you can move closer to the microphone. Sorry about that, but I'm hearing you softly. I'm not sure if others are as well.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yeah, just a big thank you to everyone. This is super interesting and very broad discussion. So I guess I don't know if my question fits very well. It's just that I was wondering about something that Jolene Sanjak picked up very quickly about the voluntary guidelines and these kind of global instruments to foster land governance and all that. And just in the context of what we all just spoke about, agreeing on, you know, the importance of bottom-up approaches and flexibility in the future of land policy and all that. What maybe just kind of an open, broad question to throw out is just what kind of role or how promising could these kind of guidelines be, and how impactful could they be designed, especially considering all these different dimensions of land governance? And I guess that field of tension between this bottom up and the top down elements to policy making. So I'm looking also, I'm researching into these global codes of conduct for responsible investments and stuff like that. So I'm just very curious what the panelists would think about that. These
Great,
specific
thank you.
guidelines are.
Great, excellent. So Stephen, please go ahead.
I wanted to respond to that great question a little bit and really take advantage of you know, Catherine's some of Catherine's comments as sort of a springboard to respond. It really is about the relation between sort of the outside and the context. I've been throwing that word around, but this is, you know, the systems within which people live and work. And you know, the Lorenzo's use of the word sluggishness was a wonderful academic term, and because that was the experience. There was a set of interventions around, as he noted, certifying, for the most part, customary land. Okay, and there wasn't the kind of response that the you know, the donors, the governments, and others were anticipating. And I think part of the explanation, I think this comes back, I hope it comes back to the question, is that customary tenure is really an expression of the rural social system. People get land as a social right by virtue of their membership, their bona fide, legitimate membership in a social system, in a community. Whereas people get land typically through certifying processes. They go to the state, and what does the state deliver? Land rights based on contract. Okay, and so somehow that contract is another kind of instrument, incentive, source of authority that actually didn't get traction. What continues to matter in terms of delivery of security is your membership in the community. And there's a lot of evidence that growing non-farm income important to rural households, all of that. The opportunity costs of agricultural labor is at the point where people ask, why are people even sort of maintaining an interest in land? And a response is the rural social system continues to matter. And land is just one expression of that. And so that's kind of, I think, a contextual reality. But in terms of interventions, still interventions have had some effect. The examples I gave on gender and women in Ethiopia and Rwanda. And, in the social system context, people have differential status, and particularly women have lower status than men. And there's a wonderful article by a woman named Honig. I think Catherine might know her. She works in Senegal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It speaks of customary privilege. That's really about social status, different status within what? The social system is reflected in your land rights. And so the interventions in Ethiopia or Rwanda, I think there was purpose there, tried to kind of diminish the distance in customary, but at the end of the day, it had to be in customary status. In other words, the customary system had to buy into it. And in Ethiopia, which I will characterize as principally customary rules prevail, by the kinds of, people are members of social groups that are associated with territory. And even arguably in Rwanda, we're having a discussion about this. Now it's interesting, just as an aside, although legally married women get equal rights to inherit, they get half the portion of land by law, the other half goes to the adult children. In terms of the customary regime, the adult children resist that. Okay, so that part of the kind of intervention in the system, in the rural social, isn't getting traction. It was an attempt to introduce a contractual arrangement, and it isn't getting a traction for women legally married. It isn't scoring. Whereas women who are in polygamous marriages who are not legally married, because the law says individuals can actually register their plots, are getting traction. So these are the kinds of things, and this comes back, to the questioners, because there's people looking outside, presuming they understand what's going on inside, and they don't, and I often don't, or don't understand sufficiently. And I think the focus is not so much on tenure initially, but on the social system, the rural social system, of which tenure is an expression. So how are your interventions engaging with the social system and in all of its sort of complexity, as Catherine is pointing out? Sorry to go on for so long.
No, that was great. So what I have now is wonderfully a queue of questions.
Great.
So I'm just going to read out the queue of questions that I have so far. So next, I have Chris, Penrose Buckley, then I have Julene, then I have Julian. And so I think I've got you guys in the queue, and we'll just go through that. And then if other people want to raise their hand, I can take note of that. So for all of you who I've said, you can lower your blue hands if you want it. I've got you in the queue. I'm going to turn it over to Jolene, and then we'll come back to Chris after that. Go ahead, Jolene.
Thank you. So I'm going to go at a more macro picture to answer Caroline's question, because I think there's a couple of angles on the VG, and there's actually an active discussion with Chris and myself and some other people around the question of what have they done and why haven't they gotten all the way where we thought they might, or why haven't they really changed the dynamic? So basically the voluntary guidelines and there's other standards out there, particularly around technology and responsible investment, but the VGDTs were actually informed by quite a lengthy participatory consultation consultative process primarily at the regional level with multiple different stakeholder groups, and then negotiated across FAO member states with active civil society participation. So I want to make sure that's known too, because it was actually a different and maybe unique for the time period at the UN, where it was not strictly a top-down, like leaders of state just talking to each other and coming up with them. So there was a long process before that, and CSO participation all the way through the negotiations. And in some countries, and I would say broadly, therefore, they have shaped awareness of some of the key issues that we were concerned about and still maybe are concerned about. And so the point I was making about the social entrepreneurs is, I think they are in fact targeting some of the, so one of the challenges was the approaches for doing land titling, land registration, land documentation were too expensive, not affordable, not reaching the poorer people and people in vulnerable situations and stuff. So this model is coming in and trying to create as a solution to that in some way. On technology, I think not just social entrepreneurs, but vendors writ large have actually gone a long way to adapting models that have flexible data models that can cover not just one-on-one, I own this piece of land, period, relationships, different kinds of relationships. Maybe I've not gotten far enough. That was actually one of the agenda questions that we didn't get to, and I haven't really thought enough through to give any kind of more remarks, but there has been progress. It hasn't been far enough. The challenge of implementation being sluggish is real, and there are very few countries. There are some countries where there were multi-stakeholder platforms launched, rich discussions happened. There's actually a paper out there that gives some good examples of this and some policy changes happened, but then implementing those policy changes is sluggish for all the reasons that people said. So there's a real need to figure out, what will it take, or is it even possible for a global best practice principles document that maybe changes mindsets in some ways? Is it possible that that translates into locally owned, locally shaped implementation practices? That's the big question of the day, in my view.
Great, thank you so much. I see that Chris has joined, perhaps on another line. Chris, do you want to come back to your intervention?
Yeah, I'll try again. Can you hear me now, right, Alex?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I missed part of what Jalene just said, but what I was going to say on the VGGT is that I think they've been incredibly influential in shaping sort of thinking around, particularly around this concept of legitimate tenure rights, right? And so that's sort of something which has really caught hold. I mean, it hasn't been implemented across the board. I mean, the IFC performance standards, I think, still don't really take on board that basic sort of idea and principle. But I think it's been very influential. Some of you will have been following the general comment on the International Convention on Economic and Social Rights on Land, which is really drawing heavily on the VGGT. But I think the big challenge is that governments obviously aren't suddenly going to change how they operate based on some international soft law instrument. And so I think that's obviously one of the challenges. The question I had for Jalene, I thought the examples you gave around private sector kind of efforts in Ghana and other countries, Meridian I'm familiar with, to map and document rights on a fee basis, I think is really interesting. I guess the question is, to what sense can that really go to scale, and to what extent is it sort of a basis for an equal approach? I think there's a risk there that those approaches tend to work in urban, peri-urban areas. And although I've had conversations with Meridian about the kind of profile of farmers who pay $100 or euros for registration, it's not entirely convinced that it's a model for going to scale in large parts of Africa. But interested in any reflections you have on that. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So I know, Julian, there was just a question directed at you, but I'm going to pass over to Julian, and then we'll come right back. I see your hand, which is excellent. So Julian, you're up next.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me okay? I might be having some microphone issues. Okay, all right. Well, it's on a slightly different topic. It's going back really to Catherine's drawing together of issues and the discussion about local context that Stephen focused on. I'm really interested to hear what the panelists have to say. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I did want to drop in the question of what people think about the question of political openness to look more closely at context, local dynamics, and understand what people want, and take perhaps more nuanced and experimental approaches to land reform. And I'm asking that really partly because of the point that Lorenzo made about the evidence, that certain evidence that in certain countries the policy space may actually be closing down as governments continue to drive for often large-scale investments, but technical partnerships and trade in order to re-kickstart economies as a result of the COVID pandemic, and this kind of occupation of the policy space, and even the occupation of land, the pushing through of land investment projects, etc., in certain countries, that in some respects the policy space appears to be closing down. Yet the emphasis, I think, from the insights we heard from Stephen, we also heard from Fabian about the context in Kenya, where it seems to be really important to adopt a more nuanced approach, an approach that really speaks to local, rural, or urban social systems in devising appropriate interventions for securing rights and for governing land resources. That this requires an investment in knowledge management. And as Catherine was saying, really, in a sense, we do need a generation of bottom-up researchers who can really engage. But unless governments are open, whether they're donor governments who perhaps also focusing, like UK now, on trade policy, on restarting the economy, and the role of foreign aid and cooperation in that process, down to African governments and other countries that find themselves in similar predicaments and really are focusing on investment and sometimes focusing on continuing drives to formalize land rights in one-size-fits-all models, because that fits the economic, sometimes the technocratic visions of development policy. So what do we do about that? In that, the policy space in some respects seems to be closing down, yet we have a lot of evidence and a lot of good ideas that actually we do need more nuanced approaches that speak to what people want and need in a difficult and changing context, post-COVID, demographic growth, continuing drives for economic investment, and of course climate change as well, which really has significant effect, and where there's a lot of, these days, concern around how to get development finance to the ground. Now, land rights are going to be relevant to that. So it's really a question of how we can invent and devise systems that do that. I know Chris mentioned the flexibility, the importance of having the flexibility to design appropriate approaches. But, do we see that? Is this likely to happen? What do people think? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Julian, for that very provocative question. I'm sure there'll be lots of ideas that people want to put forth in response. I'm going to turn first to Jolene, and then people who do want to respond to that, please just put your hand up and I'll put you in the queue. Thanks.
Okay, and I'll try to be really quick. So I want to make clear, again, we only had a limited time, but I don't see it as a panacea, Chris, but I do see it as an important part of scaling. And of course, like everything in land, context dependent. There are increasing examples where these efforts are being made in rural areas, and also increasing attention to looking at and trying to practice sort of like sliding scale pricing or different prices, and some parts of the pricing can be subsidized either by a governmental agency or by private companies. Colombia is actually really, really interesting context. In Colombia, there's increasing companies, like just one example of Flower Association, private Flower Association, is offsetting part of the cost of Suyo doing its social entrepreneurial approach to land titling as a benefit to its staff. Staff want their houses and land parcels titled, and they're getting it through this program, and it's partially subsidized, but it's also pay for or fee for service approach. And so it's getting the pricing, getting that subsidy titrated to the equation, and also recognizing that there are contexts. So like there's other parts of Colombia where the dynamics are so complicated in terms of natural things, ethnicity, drugs, crimes, war, post-war things, that this model's not ready. It's not really right for that, right? It just won't work in those contexts. So, but there is, I think, if you think about it this way, there's other projects like Heifer International, Mercy Corps. Some of the bigger NGOs are starting to also do this. And it's like Heifer in Honduras is working with a fee-for-service unit that was created in the national government after the World Bank project to be able to continue titling on a fee-for-service basis. For example, they've done that with a coffee association, and they're now with Heifer looking at it in a context of a chocolate growers association to kind of say, look, joined up development. there are these big ag efforts. We're helping farmers in all these ways in value chains. Let's also give them an option to get their land documented if they need it. And those, if you think about how many programs there are out there like Heifer and those things, that can be a really big, important part of scaling in a way that can happen faster in less time. Again, I listed off all the research questions, including social impact. So those need to be thoughtfully considered before anybody kind of pushes this into a scaled thing. But I think there's potential for it. That's why I wanted to put out for like discussion, basically.
Great, excellent. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left in the official session. So what I think we should do is in the queue, I have Stephen and Fabian. And so I think we should take those two contributions. And then what I'd like to do is, I see Lorenzo as well. And so what I was going to suggest is that those panelists who have not yet sort of had another, made another intervention to go around, so that would include Ruth, that would include Odenda. So I'll just come back around to make sure everyone has had a second chance. But we can first turn to Stephen and then Fabian.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I just put my comment in the chat, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Great. Maybe we'll come back, Stephen, if there's more time, because I'm sure there would be some benefits to your talking through that. But now we can turn to Fabian if you're ready. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Apart from just want to comment on what Julian has said. Apart from the policy space closing, it's important to remember we have an aging civil service. Mm-hmm. And this is really going to impact, particularly in the land sector, quite in the next 2 to 5 years, quite a number of that stuff is going to exit, and the government is not necessarily employing. That's just one of the things. Avenues, so it's not just the policy space, but capabilities within the sector and capacity. Secondly, there are avenues for exploitation. For instance, I believe the revision of the land policy in Kenya is one very critical avenue. The implementation of the Community Land Act is another very critical avenue. The third avenue is the whole idea of devolution. We can now work with governments that are not national, but the county governments are available. So for me, I look at there are avenues of exploitation, but we must consider the challenges broadly. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Fabian. So what I'm gonna do now is go to Lorenzo and then Ruth and then Odenda. So if other people also want to jump in, you can put your hand up, but I'm going to take those panelists first. So Lorenzo, you're next on my list.
Thank you, Alex. I was going to pick up on Julian's question and also to some extent Caroline's. So the issue of policy space closing and what that means for us and this work. First of all, of course, contexts are different. So there is significant variation in that overarching trend. And we have been exploring these issues with quite several partner organizations we collaborate with on issues of land policy, investment, etc. And I mean, it's a difficult question. And I think the multiple dimensions there. One is that ultimately we need to accept that there will be contexts in which it's just very difficult to work on this topic, particularly a politically sensitive topic like land, or it may be more it may be easier to work on specific sub-themes, so the entries might vary depending on the context. The second thought is that there are different ways of working on land, whether as researchers or practitioners, and of course the political context has to influence or has to inform choices in that respect. So we currently do collaborate with researchers and practitioners in some countries where the political space is, I would say, rather constrained, but that has an impact on how we structure the work, right? So around dialogue rather than sort of advocacy around, there are some choices really around how the work is done. And then ultimately also a third point that I was going to flag is which we've discussed with partners, is that in some cases where we don't think that there's going to be significant change now because the space is so constrained, but there may be still value in creating a platform of evidence, proposals for reform, alliances, which can then be brought to bear when the political space opens or the political opportunity opens. So we've also been thinking in those terms with some of our partners. So doing the heavy work now so that we're prepared when the opportunity opens up. And I was mentioning the the question of that Caroline asked, because I think there's also a link between the two questions, right? The issue of bottom up and VGT, and this issue of policy space or political space even. I think that there is a link, because in my mind, the VGT and bottom-up strategies can be mutually reinforcing. And again, in collaboration with the partner organizations we work with, we have used them and seen them used in that way. So typically you would have, before you would have a civil society organization telling a government you should protect these type of rights. It's it's not acceptable that our legislation doesn't protect the rights of pastoralists or customary rights, etc., etc. But it was effectively their opinion, right? And the risk was that it became some sort of quasi-polarized discussion with civil society sort of bashing the government. Now there is an instrument that, albeit very, very open-ended, right? The legitimate tenure right is very open-ended as a concept. It somehow diffuses some of the tension that there was, at least in some of those conversations. So we collaborate with organizations that find it very useful to say, it's not just us telling you that you need to change it. This is an accepted document, and we can help you actually implement this doc. So it changes the nature of the conversation, particularly where the political space is very constrained. I find that that's potentially a useful role that a document like the VGT can play. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Lorenzo. Next, I want to give an opportunity to Ruth. If you want to jump into the conversation, that would be great.
Yes, I found this really, really rich. And I think in particular, often in the drive to come up with useful information, there's been a drift toward more quantitative, rigorous impact kinds of things. And Steve's point about the realist synthesis brought back the notion that we need to look at people's own agency. And how do people themselves respond, and different kinds of people respond to the reforms? So not only what does the woman do, the man do, the chief do, the administrators do, and getting that grounded notion of how changes will affect behavior, which will affect these other things. I think there is a real role for having people who do grounded, qualitative work that are partnering with the more quantitative and policy-oriented studies. We need to bring that back into the mix, because if we've looked at historically what research was done, a lot of it started with the more qualitative understandings. I think we need to bring that back in as a counter to more technocratic orientations. There's a role for both, but let's try to get them working together if we're looking ahead for what's the research agenda. I'll put that one out there, and keeping in mind, like Fabian's, what's going to be useful to her. We need to bring those two together, I would say.
Great, thank you so much, Ruth. I'll definitely second the motion to engage in research that draws on multiple types of data. I think that's definitely something to champion. I would like to invite Odenda, if you want to make an additional statement. We'd love to hear from you again.
Yeah, I think what I wanted just to make additional statement is to say that policy space has never always been open. It has been forced open. And I think the most closing of the policy space has been COVID, because some of the limitations are beyond our own liking. Even through activism, we can't do much. But I think we have seen situations in Kenya, for example, at different times, from the political, social, civil society organization, people have always stood up and made things work. But I can also see that that hope is not lost. When I see what people do in South Africa, for instance, taking on the state where necessary, go to courts. I've seen with a lot of patience and of course God's hand helping Tanzanian scenario, for example, people have not lost hope, even when it was really tough on them. I would equally say that places even like Rwanda, for example, which has been cited here, Rwanda has been a very good model. Everybody says we don't know whether it can be replicated. But I think the question which goes is that beyond Kagame, what is Rwanda? Sometimes I always shocked to ask that question because I like the strength and the way he has done things, but it cannot depend on one man if you're looking at policy going forward. The situation in Ethiopia with the Tigrays are now taking on the state. We know little, but a lot is happening. And there's a lot of those kind of things. But the other element we're looking at the space closing or not closing to policy would be from the north, where basically they have bankrolled policies. Are there still governments in the north who are willing to bankroll policies? Have they changed? Narrow nationalism in the north, will it allow this to happen? Or what interests are going to drive this? You know, I think these are things which people need to be thinking through because I think we have benefited from the northern governments bilaterally through multilateral fundings and donor funding of different sorts. Is there still energy from those sources going forward? I think those are questions that need to be labored. In terms of from the scholarly element, will we be able to team up from the south and the north searching together policy issues? Or will the north want to come in, is it Lorenzo who said it, in the guerrilla methods of researching other than the open searching? What are the chances? What is the room to do this? And I think these are things that we all hope that space will open, willing, because we are all determined. We are all aging. Some of us have been around on these issues. When I look at our faces, we are getting tired, but we still have the last kick. We are saying, no, we are not going to let it go. So some of our colleagues in the generation that follows, they are very enthusiastic. And I think for me, just as much as Lucalo says, the staff are aging, I think there's no way absolutely you will not replace those staff, regardless of the IMF conditionalities or otherwise, because otherwise you close shop, essentially. And who is going to close shop? So I think it is not going to be easy. And I think that is one of the things we do. Even right now, people are hiring, but is it open-ended hiring or is it out of nepotism and all those kind of things? I can tell you from where I stand, from the Kenyan position, I think Kenyans are not tired. If I check what they are doing in the courts, even right now as we speak, and what they are doing with the politicians, they seem to give politicians a bit of a step forward, but they are not ready to let go. So I think that gives me hope that we are going to stand up for them. And I think for the scholars into this, the scholarly work, let's keep on authoring. Lorenzo, keep on having your pamphlets, if not your books, coming through. I think they help people pick up. Ruth, don't give up on the commons. People will still need the commons. And I think for me, that is what encourages. So all of us have been around and let's keep going. There will be always a generation behind us, as they would say, Hussein Bullet retires and there's another one who comes up to keep the spring going. Thanks.
Oh, I love this contribution at the end of our official time. I find it very encouraging. So thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. So I think we are at the end of our official time, but I think we can extend, this room will not disappear as I understand it, although, who knows with the technology we're using. But I know that some people may have prior commitments. And so if you need to sign off, that's totally fine. I think just, in advance of that, I just want to extend a huge thank you to everyone for coming today, for participating, for Matt and Julian for doing a lot of organizational work, and to Kathy for her wonderful comments, and just to everyone for contributing. I think it was a wonderful discussion. I definitely learned a lot. That being said, I guess if people would like to sort of continue the conversation, I'm very happy to keep on facilitating the conversation, or if we want to kind of have it be more of a free-for-all, I'm open to that too. Maybe whatever we think would be the best way.
Maybe, Alex, we could just have a sort of show of hands, so to speak, about how many people are able to stay on, and also people might want a short comfort break.
Yes, I think that's a great idea. So maybe we can do a show of hands of who could stay on. So I see.
If we have to move through.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we have a few people. Excellent. So what I would say is maybe we take 10 minutes. If that's okay? And maybe we'll come back. Is 10 minutes too long or too short? I'm not sure how long we need. We have been going at for a while. 5 minutes, says Kathy. I trust your lead on this. So let's come back at 5 to 5 British time. So in 5 minutes, and then we'll resume the conversation. Thanks so much.